My name is Mark Norbury, and in this talk we're going to learn about marriage. This is for anybody who is married, or anybody who's considering marriage, anyone who's dating somebody or going out with somebody. And in this talk we want to learn about marriage and how to make the best of it. If you're fully prepared for marriage and are aware of its full grace, then your marriage is more likely to be fruitful and to be a happy one. Now, let's have a look at marriage and what exactly it is. So it's obviously a relationship going on between a husband and a wife. And right at the heart of that relationship is the sexual act, which is the consummation of marriage. And from that sexual act comes a third person, the baby that's born from the marriage. And that's exactly what's going on in the Trinity. There is a love between the Father and the Son, and from that love a third person is derived. So within the three persons of the Trinity we can see the whole of marriage embodied. So marriage is therefore a very dignified and a wondrous thing, because it's a reflection of what's going on within the Godhead. It's also a reflection of the love between Jesus Christ and the Church. And Jesus Christ gave his life on the cross for his bride, the Church. He totally gave himself for her out of love, selfless sacrifice, sacrificial love. And that's the kind of love that married people aspire to, where the husband is giving himself totally for his wife and giving his life for her, and the wife is giving her life to the husband, giving her life totally for him. And as you have this complete selfless giving love between two people, that will bond them together and hold them together in a love that is a reflection of Christ's love for his church. Now, marriage was created by God to share in his creation and to create communities where love is what binds people together, just like in the Trinity. It's therefore a very dignified and wondrous sacrament. And it's actually the vocation that most of us are called to. We were called to be fruitful and multiply. Marriage is a very good thing, it's a very beautiful thing. And the majority of people in the world are called to be married. And God said to mankind, after he made us, be fruitful and multiply. He wants us to be fruitful and multiply. And he put that sexual drive within us so that we would be fruitful and multiply. Now, the consummation of marriage is the sexual act. A marriage becomes fully complete once you have the sexual act there. And within each man and woman is the sexual drive that makes them want to procreate. And God planted this beautiful desire within us before the fall, and hence the sexual act is a very holy thing. Disorders in our relationships don't arise from anything natural, but from sin itself. It's part of our fallen nature, any disorders or problems or sinfulness that comes from the sexual act. And hence, but the sexual drive itself is not sinful, although sin can arise from its application. Now, marriage takes part in the giving of life. When we look into the eyes of a newly born baby, we grasp something of the glory of life's creation and a greater sense of meaning to life itself, and also a greater sense of meaning to our own lives personally and to our own calling. Now, our highest calling is to love, and that's what God has called us to do. Now, a married person is called ultimately to love his or her spouse selflessly, giving him or herself completely for the other person and putting their needs before his or her own. Now, why is this? Well, this is exactly how God loves us. He loves us completely selflessly. And we see that in Jesus Christ and how he lived his life in love and service for others. And in fact, love is the personification of who God is, his very nature. And so, marriage is a very high calling. Now, if we go back to creation, as God creates each thing, he says, this is good. Creates the next thing, this is good.
But when he comes to create man, he sees that man is alone, and he says, this is not good. It's not good that man should be alone. And so then he creates a woman. And when he sees the man and woman together, their union he sees as being very good. So it's, for the first time in the Bible, we see the words very good. And now, marriage is for the good of the married couple and for their salvation. So each person in the marriage is helping the salvation of the other person by loving them and cherishing them and helping them on their journey in life. And this mutual support of each other helps to overcome sin. And the good thing about this is it's good for ourselves. It helps us to overcome self-absorption and possibly egoism and the pursuit of one's own happiness. So if we're living our life in pursuit of another person's happiness, this saves us from the pursuit of our own happiness. And it's a very good calling to actually be at the service of someone else and be always seeking the happiness of another person. And so it opens our hearts up to this mutual aid and self-giving. And this is particularly evident when children come along, and we see how parents love their children and are willing to give so much to them and to sacrifice for their children. It's a very selfless kind of giving. So we see here that marriage is a very high calling for all of these reasons, and it's an imitation of who God is and how he loves us. And because marriage is such a high calling, it's indissoluble, and this is how God intended marriage to be, that the man and the woman at creation should come together and remain together. And so Adam only had one wife, that was Eve, and they were joined as one flesh. And then over the centuries that changed a little bit, but this was always the calling, that you should only have one wife. And Jesus in his teaching restores the order of creation that had been disturbed by sin and hard-heartedness. And so he's going back to the beginning. It's going back to the position where you only have one wife, and also that marriage is indissoluble. So even though Moses had this law whereby you could divorce your wife, that was not how God intended it right in the beginning. And so, as Jesus says, a man who divorces his wife and marries another, except in the case of an illicit marriage, is guilty of adultery. And we see that in Matthew's Gospel in chapter 19, verse 9. And so Catholics follow this teaching, and so hence there's no such thing as Catholic divorce. There is something called annulment, and annulment is very different from divorce. Annulment actually says that the marriage was not a valid marriage in the first place, so the couple weren't actually married in the first place. And a common case of this is a lack of consent. For example, one of the partners was under some sort of constraint or impeded by a law that was not revealed at the time. Another case is a lack of freedom. For example, there was some sort of coercion or some grave fear. Another case is where there's a lack of understanding of what was actually being entered into, e.g. through some mental illness on the part of one of the people in the marriage. And so these are the different cases of annulment, and in legal terms, annulment and divorce are very different. Divorce actually acknowledges that there is a marriage, and it is dealing with the dissolution of that marriage in the present time. Okay, so it acknowledges that you've been married for all of these years, and now we're going to end that marriage. And if both parties are willing and able, divorce is always successful. Whereas the annulment process actually goes back to the marriage, goes back in and investigates back in time when the actual marriage took place, and it investigates whether the couple were actually married in the first place. So it's looking to the past to examine the marriage ceremony itself and the circumstances surrounding that marriage to discern if it was a real marriage. And in this sense, it's actually impartial to the desire of the couple in the present time. And its conclusion may go either way. So however much the couple may want to be annulled, if there's no case for annulment, then it just won't happen. Okay. So there we have the differences between divorce and annulment.
Okay, now let's have a look a bit more closely at the consummation of marriage. The sexual act has a twofold aim: for the good of the couple and for the transmission of life. Now, as we know, a child is not delivered by a stalk. A child springs from the very heart of the mutual self-giving of marriage, the great act of love that creates life as its fruit and fulfillment. So, in this way, when a married couple consummate their marriage, they're interpreting the love within the Trinity, and also the love between God and creation. And finally, they're also interpreting the love between Christ and the Church. Now, sexual love is restricted to marriage. Sex outside marriage is a nonsense, because how can a couple who are not married consummate a marriage that does not exist? Fornication tends to foster a spirit of self-satisfaction and self-absorption, and couples who have practiced it often struggle with marriage. So if they've had sexual relationships prior to being married with each other, or maybe with other sexual partners, they may struggle with marriage because the dignity of the sexual act has been lost in those previous relationships. And until they fully understand the sexual act and what it's really all about, it can be a bit of a struggle. Now, God has created us for one sexual partner. It's actually part of our biology and our desire for intimacy. Some medical research has shown that sexually transmitted diseases propagate amongst people who have had sex with more than one partner, and their probability of propagation increases the more partners they have had. So this tends to imply that we're only made to have one sexual partner, because disease and sickness is not obviously part of human nature. It's not the way that God intended us to be. The sexual act and the creation of life are intrinsically linked. Any attempt to create a new life outside the natural sexual union of a married couple is actually wrong by nature. And this includes artificial insemination. And anything that subverts the sexual act is also sinful, for example, pornography or lust. Anything that removes the openness to the creation of life from sex is also sinful. For example, contraception or any other artificial birth control methods. Because a marriage without an openness to receiving children through the natural sexual act is not a marriage fully entered into, because the very nature of marriage, according to God's purpose, is ordered to the procreation of children. One might argue that sex using condoms still helps to express the love between the couple. However, in doing this, they've kept God out of their relationship. Marriage is a sacrament that involves God at its very centre, and a desire to obey His command to be fruitful and multiply.